Mr. Tim Duggan and Mr. Robert Nicholson, thank you very much for your attendance here today. You're very welcome. I'll ask you in a couple of moments to do your opening presentation, which we received yesterday, and thank you very much. Members will then be invited to ask questions. Before that, however, I wish to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of Section 17.2L of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to this committee. However, if you're directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter, and you continue to so do, you're entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You're directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you're asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise nor make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official, either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. Colleagues, once again, I would remind you with the mobile phones, if you have them, you might turn them off or turn them to flight mode. And at this stage, Mr. Duggan, I'd ask you if you'd like to make your opening presentation, please. Okay.
I'll just thanks very much indeed, Chairman, for having us along. It's critically important that we get to meet and discuss this proposal with as many people as possible, and critically important in that is the committee. So we're delighted you could find time in your schedule to fit us in. Just a couple of opening remarks, and then Robert will present on the AE saving system itself and the straw man. You'll know that the government set out in its roadmap for pensions reform back in February that it intended pursuing a supplementary retirement savings system for the nation based on an auto-enrolment type scheme. And it set it out in some detail in that roadmap with the promise that a more definitive straw man type proposal would be provided later in the year. And that's what we published in August. Now, just to clarify for the committee, it is a proposal. It is not the definitive government proposal. And the reason the government has published a straw man is because over the last couple of years the department has engaged in extensive consultation with up to 35 different stakeholder groups comprising employer representatives, employee representatives, the community and voluntary pillar, and indeed industry. And while there was absolute agreement that some form of supplementary pension scheme was necessary for Ireland, there was absolutely no agreement whatsoever on how that should be done or in what form. And consequently, we felt that the best way to anchor the discussion and get the debate going for real was, rather than people talking about conceptual ideas and abstract notions, was to actually produce something tangible and get people discussing that. The rights, the wrongs, the advantages, the disadvantages, the pros and cons. And consequently, that's what this straw man is meant to do, anchor that discussion and debate. It's something that will feed into the government's ultimate decisions around auto-enrolment, in the sense that there is this public consultation based on the straw man, but in addition to that, the department is assiduously gathering evidence and data from a whole host of different sources to try and come up with good analysis or evidence building to help the government to finalise its decisions. And in addition to that, we're conducting both a macro and microeconomic impact assessment of an auto-enrolment system on the nation. So all of those things will feed into the ultimate government decision. And the last thing I'd like to say is that we haven't done this in an ivory tower, so to speak. We have been engaging extensively, as I said, with 35 different stakeholder groups over the last couple of years. But in addition to that, we've been engaging extensively in international discussion, where we've engaged with the OECD, but also a host of other countries and experts from other countries who have implemented similar type arrangements in their jurisdictions to try and make sure that we worked out what seemed to work best, why it worked, the things that didn't work so well, the lessons they learned, and to try and avoid some of the pitfalls that have occurred in other countries in as best as we can. in a dynamic type of environment. So what we thought we'd do this morning is, as quickly as we can, take you through the straw man, not only to tell you what's in it, but also to explain some of the rationale and the thinking behind the proposal that's been made. And hopefully that in itself will answer a lot of questions that you might have. And then after that, we'll do our best to answer any questions you still have after that. So.
What's the timeline? When is the government saying that this is going to be a decision made or not? Is it 4 years, 5 years?
Well, the government has already stated that it intends to begin the implementation of auto-enrolment in 2022. So the time between now and then is to finalise the design, develop the legislation, do major communications and awareness campaigns, build the relevant IT and any agency formats that are required to pursue it and so on. So there's a lot of work definitely to be done between now and 2022, but there's an absolute commitment to commencing in 2022. So, Rob, I'll hand over.
Okay, thanks, committee. I'll try and bring you through the proposals in a little bit of depth, and to be frank, we need a little bit of depth because automatic enrolment, if it's introduced, will fundamentally reform supplementary pensions provision in Ireland, not just for now, but for generations to come and for the broader population. So it's a really significant reform, probably the most fundamental reform of pensions policy in a generation or two. What I might lay out first is just the elements of AE, as I'll call it, that are already confirmed by government. So, as you just asked, Deputy, the government has committed that AE will begin in 2022. The intention is that it will supplement the state pension and complement existing private provision. It's a different population of individuals, of employees that are being targeted, and employees that haven't saved previously. It will be an earnings-related workplace saving system where the employee can choose to opt out. So they'll be automatically enrolled, but they choose if they don't want to avail of the benefit that's being provided to them. It will be a defined contribution model with personal accounts. So you will own your own personal account. For the first time, employees, employers and the state will each be required to contribute. That will be cast under legislation, and as I say, it's a first time. There's no mandatory requirement at the moment for employers to contribute to supplementary pensions. In the broad sense, the system is intended to facilitate choice, but not to demand member choice. And that is particular to the type of clients that we're talking about, the type of employees. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. The elements of the automatic enrolment consultation that are up for discussion, and that is the broad operational structure and governance of the system. And we lay out a proposal in the straw man, which we think is an appropriate line of flight. The target membership, who will be enrolled and why will they be enrolled? The employee and employer contribution rates, again, we make a proposal, but it's up for discussion in terms of the impact on employers, employees and the economy more generally. The shape and colour of the state financial incentive, what's the most appropriate financial incentive for the type of individual we're talking about. The number of providers, the type of savings options they'll be providing, and the default options where an individual doesn't make choices, what happens. And then the conditionality around member opt-out, how wide or thin should that be? The conditions around re-enrolment. If you opt out, should you be re-enrolled? Should you be able to take periods out of saving if you have more demands on your limited income? And then the conditions around income drawdown. What sort of shape should the income drawdown provide over the course of your retirement years? So that is basically what's covered in the straw man. Maybe just to open with the kind of policy side of why AE. We have a multi-pillar pension system like most developed economies where the pillars are intended to share and diversify risk between the state, employers and employees. In terms of the state pension, which is pillar 1 we'll call it, that is intended to deliver on a narrow interpretation of adequacy, so to provide a minimum level of income so individuals avoid poverty in retirement. At the moment, 1.5% of over 66s are in consistent poverty, so resources are rightly targeted at that group. Beyond that, the state pension largely delivers on its policy objective as it stands in terms of avoiding poverty. As I say, 1.5% for over 66s compared to an average of 8.3% for the rest of the population in consistent poverty. Over the long term, you'll be very well aware that there's challenges for the sustainability of the state pension. our demographics highlight that the number of workers for the employed population was going to drop from about 4.9 to 1 to 2.3 to 1 in the next 40 years or so. So obviously the numbers contributing to the system versus the numbers drawing for the system creates funding challenges. The cost of the state pension is going to go up by approximately 1 billion every 5 years, an extra 17,000 pensioners a year, and the number of pensioners will double from approximately 600,000 to 1.2 million over that 40-year time horizon. And our longevity in retirement means that the pressure to maintain the state pension as is will increase rather than decrease. So the capacity to go beyond that minimum level of provision around avoiding poverty will become under increasing pressure rather than less pressure. So there will be less capacity to do more effectively, even to stand still. So after Pillar 1 largely achieves its objective, we then move to supplementary pensions. And in supplementary pensions, the government incentivises people to save for a level of income that's adequate to themselves. That's a very open question as to what is adequate for yourselves. And we talk about personal adequacy. So what do I need in retirement not to suffer a reduction in my living standards? And that's what most people target. We don't want to hit retirement and not have enough income over the retirement years to do that. So in terms of that adequacy, we've only 35% of the working population in the private sector actually have supplementary pensions. So the rest will rely entirely on the state pension and secondary benefits. So as a result, the OECD, in reviewing the Irish pension system, has said the single biggest recommendation for reform is to introduce some sort of mandatory earnings-related retirement saving system. We're one of only 2 of 37 OECD countries without an earnings-related, mandatory earnings-related element to our supplementary retirement saving, the other being New Zealand, which has a fairly sophisticated backup. The Citizens' Assembly voted in June of this year that some form of mandatory system should be introduced, 87% of the Citizens' Assembly. So over the last year and a half, and in fact many previous governments have indicated a desire to move towards increase in supplementary pensions. Broadly speaking, we have 3 choices. Individuals either save more through tax or personal savings, they work longer, or they suffer a reduction in their living standards in retirement. Broadly speaking, it boils down to those 3 points. Supplementary pensions provision in Ireland for the last 25 years has tried to increase the coverage of people with supplementary pensions. Hasn't managed to do it. It's maintained more or less constant at the levels it is now for the last 25 years, despite financial incentives. The adequacy of those retirement benefits are also under question in terms of that goal of trying to maintain living standards. So in effect, there's been market failure. We haven't done what we have intended to do through public policy. Voluntarism hasn't worked. So with that, the government decided, and as I say, it's been a long-standing goal, to move towards some form of mandation, quasi or full mandation. And that is to address the needs of the 860,000 or so employees who don't have pensions coverage and about 240,000 self-employed, to begin to try and encourage them to save more. That's the broad background. Move into a system of mandation where you're compelling people to save to whatever extent we do. You obviously need to decide what's the criteria for telling somebody they should be in a system. When you're reducing or taking contributions from somebody's pay and putting it into a personal account for them, you need to have a good reason why to explain to them, because it is, as I say, a system of mandation. So we've carried out extensive research over the last period of time using CSO data and household spending, and we've analysed household spending in the period up to retirement. And if you look at that green line, that is the replacement rate for incomes that's provided by the state pension. And you can see at the lower end, the state pension at in and around 13,000 provides a high replacement rate, in and around 80% for somebody on 60,000. As you move up the income scale, that reduces. And what grows is the savings gap that individuals have to be able to achieve that goal of not having a reduction in their living standards at retirement. So that population in between those 2 lines are, broadly speaking, who should be in automatic enrolment if you agree with the policy objective of trying to avoid reduction in living standards in retirement. It's a notoriously controversial exercise, I have to say, trying to identify what exactly you should have in retirement. And you have all sorts of stuff like tax coming in, childcare costs, housing costs, whether you save for a pension or not, costs that won't arise in retirement. But for the generality of the population, we're confident that that replacement rate assessment is suitable. Curiously enough, we carried out this exercise independent of work that was done in the UK by the Pensions Commission, which set their target group for their automatic enrolment system, and it was broadly similar in terms of the outcomes. So we're confident enough that the much sort of vaunted 50% replacement rate doesn't suit for the generality of the population. Lower income earners need higher replacement rates, higher income earners need lower replacement rates, and that's around the element of discretionary income you have in retirement. So just to move on to the broad population of automatic enrolment savers, we have to highlight that it's a different group to current savers. So generally lesser incomes and different cohorts of employee types by employment sector. So if you look at that chart, basically you can see the higher the income, which is the blue line, the more likely it is you have a pension. So the red line is those who don't have a pension. So the lower income earners, as you can see there, to a greater degree don't have pension provision. And they are in the kind of typical sectors that you might suspect: accommodation and food services, retail, admin and support services. Also categories of employment where people frequently change jobs and have periods out of the workforce and so on. And they're also the sectors that are less commercially viable for large providers to deliver pensions to. There's less commercially viable compared to higher earners, let's say that. And that cohort, we have what's called a pot follows member approach, which I'll talk about a little bit later on, but that's what's informing that approach. Frequent job changes, frequent time out of the workforce, and we don't want people with multiple pots. So the pot follows member approach, which we have in the straw man, is based on that. Moving on again, in terms of employer type, again, a very different population to current savers. What you see there with the green line is occupational pensions coverage or personal account, and you can see the larger the employer, the more likely it is you're going to have supplementary pension savings set aside for yourself. The smaller, conversely, the smaller the type of employer, the less likely it is you're going to have cover. It's also true that smaller employers tend not to have the same level of support in terms of financial experience, HR, IR, and administrative capacity to support individuals. So that's really important. A different type of employer and a different type of employee as a generality. So, automatic enrolment, but what are we trying to achieve? If we reflect back on what I've just spoken about, mainly low, medium income earners with smaller employers, for a system not just now, but that will exist in the coming decades, fundamentally reshaping Irish pension provision as it stands. We need to address the challenges that are out there for this particular population. We need the right product for the population. We need to remove the barriers to saving that have prevented us getting into the kind of coverage and adequacy that we've been searching for. We need to make sure that we maintain competition and choice, but address that inertia that just stops people saving for retirement. It's that old chestnut of, I'll get a pension tomorrow, I'll change my bank account tomorrow, so on. So it's a behavioural economics policy reform which relies on people's inertia effectively. We also, again, have a population who don't know too much about pensions, so we need to make choices for them. But also at the same time allow them to make their own choices if they choose to. And we need to build trust and confidence in the system. I think we'll all be aware that there is a limited trust and confidence in the wider pension system out there. Again, for the first time, employers, employees and the state will be compelled to make a contribution, at least initially, but, and always but, throughout auto enrolment, the employee will retain the choice. If they choose not to avail of it, they can. And basically the reason for that, just to link back to some of our conversations with likely members of an AE system and the kind of wider population, they don't want to have it perceived as a tax, as a mandatory system. They want to have the option to have their control in their own hands. Frequently they won't use that control, but they want to at least ostensibly have it. So, the existing system and why we're suggesting that it should be fundamentally reformed for AE. Here's some of the challenges facing Irish employees preparing for retirement. Saving late and inconsistently, or not at all. That's down to short-sightedness, myopia. The here and now always trumps the long term, even if the long term becomes more important at some point. Comparatively high fees, not in all cases, but there is an expensive fragmentation as a generality in the Irish model of pension provision. It's a figure I frequently get criticised for quoting, but we have 1% of the population of the EU, 50% of the pension schemes in the EU. Even when you strip out single-member schemes, the average Irish defined contribution scheme is 24 members. We're looking to create pension schemes with 100,000 members and the economies of scale that come with that. So we're an outlier as it stands in terms of how we provide for supplementary pensions. Not utilising, maximising state incentives. This tax relief provided at 20% and 40% at the moment, very generous top up to anybody's pension, but 65% of the population don't use it at all. Now some may not pay tax, but a large body of people who do don't utilise it. Making uninformed information decisions, that can be around just discomfort with the pensions world, but also with an element of being blinded by choice. There is such a proliferation of products out there that individuals often feel uncomfortable making decisions. A lack of confidence and trust can lead to a disengagement, and that permeates the whole system at some level, and there needs to be an improvement in our confidence and trust levels in pensions. And then basically finding suitable products. We know that the population of savers for automatic enrolment are to a greater degree lower earners, and charges and associated costs will come with the kind of commercial process of selling them, impacts on their savings. So we need to address that. So how would automatic enrolment do that? Well, it makes savings easier and automatic, and all the international evidence, we have looked extensively at basically every country that's introduced similar systems, all the evidence which suggests the most effective and efficient vehicle for improving retirement savings, and one that leads to better outcomes in the round for the individual, are these type of systems. Again, because it makes savings easy and automatic, you have default products, you have autopilots that make the good decisions for individuals if they choose not to make them themselves. You can communicate better because you have a captured population. You can improve understanding. You can introduce easy to use IT systems and so on, and give a greater level of customer service. In terms of scale, you can see reduced member charges due to larger numbers. All of our evidence incontrovertibly highlights that, all else remaining equal, scale improves governance, administration costs and investment returns to the individual. So a quick figure, we quote 0.5% of an individual's assets would be the charge for the system. That would see the ultimate pot reduced of an individual over their lifetime saving by about 10%. Something like a PRSI in Ireland is 1%, so double the cost effectively of what we're bringing forward in our proposal. And many smaller schemes would have higher charges. So a really crucial element of the reform is to drive down charges. The pot follows member approach, everywhere we've talked to, again looking at the population of frequent changers who don't understand pensions too well, don't want multiple benefit statements and multiple accounts, periods outside of saving. Every country we've talked to who haven't introduced a pot follows member approach, where you take your pot with you from job to job, have said the single biggest regret they have is not introducing that as an element of the system. So it's a key for us in terms of at least certainly targeting. You can imagine a situation, we have an average of 11 jobs per lifetime. If you have a different system, a different fund in every employer you go to, you have 11 pots to keep an eye on. So that idea of amalgamating and carrying your pot with you. In terms of saving persistency, that feature also improves savings persistency of individuals. It suits job changers, and it prevents high administration costs on small pots, which again eat away at the individual savings. So professionally selected investment choices and default options, I've already spoken about that, effectively introducing bespoke options for individuals so they don't have to make decisions for themselves. We have suggested that the system should include some sort of fiduciary responsibility on the providers, and I'll talk about the providers in a while, to make sure there's a legal duty on them to act in the best interests of members at all times. So at the moment in Ireland you have two systems broadly. You have contract systems which are delivered by the likes of banks and insurance providers, where the contract is directly between me and you as an individual, and you have trust-based systems. And the trust-based systems, there's a board of trustees who are legally obliged to make all their decisions in your own best interest. And if they don't, there's legal recourse not to. We've suggested a kind of hybrid, and we'll explain why, but at the bottom of it there should always be that fiduciary duty on trustees. So taking those principles into mind, why, and the idea that there has been market failure to date in terms of what we are trying to achieve on pensions coverage and adequacy, what do we suggest? Well, again, when we're bringing in mandation, we say AE can't be left to market forces alone. We need to mitigate the failures that have existed up until now, and we need to address those complexities and inefficiencies in the system. So we're suggesting a central processing agency, which is effectively an arm's length state body which would be independent, to introduce a framework which would set standards but would harness the expertise that exists in the private sector. And it's not an expertise that exists at the moment in the public sector more broadly. The CPA, as I say, would be statutorily independent. It wouldn't be a regulator and would itself perhaps be regulated along with the schemes it provides, but it would be, its role would be to effectively act on behalf of consumers generally. That CPA, as you can see, it would tender for what we're saying 4 registered providers, and those providers would be able to deliver services over a central hub to employees generally, providing choice, but a limited choice to allow an individual to compare one against another and choose a fund. Where they don't choose a fund, they would be automatically defaulted on a carousel basis to an appropriate default fund that's designed for them. Now, we know internationally somewhere between 90 and 99% of enrollees won't make a choice. So UK has enrolled 11 million employees, 6 million in its large nest fund. 90% of those didn't make a choice and were automatically defaulted. And that's not a bad thing. But we would always facilitate choice where the individual decides they want to make decisions for themselves. So this CPA would act as a central hub. It would be digital first, utilising kind of developing fintech technologies, providing an online platform where I can compare one against another charges in a consistent and comparable way and make a choice. It would also provide kind of basic information, required information for the employer and employees, and it would act as a contribution clearinghouse. So we use payroll systems to contribute from the individual's account, our payroll, into the CPA and onto the provider. Similar to a system in New Zealand, also used in Sweden and a couple of other countries. So it's basically harnessing but managing the service providers in the private sector. So just what the CPA might do for employees, again, it makes saving easy and automatic. The CPA effectively acts as an agent on behalf of the member. Very highly professionalised, very skilled, and an understanding of the pensions environment, obviously. It should in itself engineer and improve system governance, administration costs, communication, and investment outcomes themselves by building in this scale. It will limit the number of registered providers through a tender process, but also provide choice and competition. It will deliver this economies of scale at 0.5% absolute max charges, which effectively doesn't exist for the generality of employees in the market at the moment. And as I said, there will be a default when an employee is unwilling or unable to choose. The pot follows member capacity, again, which I say is critical, would be used through some sort of PPS number or MyGov ID or some sort of unique identifier that will allow an individual, let's say, that works in the catering sector or food. If I work in typically you wait 6 months to go into a pension scheme because an employer said it's administratively heavily, we want to make sure you're there. For frequent job changes, that leads to a long time out of the savings process. If we use this structure, I could work for Burger King for 6 months, and on day 1 my employer makes a payroll deduction to my pensions account. I can move to McDonald's in month 7 and start exactly the same thing without any breach in my savings pattern, and I can go to another retailer 6 months later and do the same thing. So we're addressing a fundamental shortfall that exists at the moment in terms of savings persistency. And again, the limited number of providers helps individuals make choice, reduces that kind of choice paralysis that exists when people are just blinded by the confusion as they see it of the pensions market. So quickly just going to employers, we have taken a kind of what might be considered a novel approach in removing the employer from the relationship. So typically there's a tripartite relationship in pension provision at industry level. The employer, the provider and the individual. What we're saying is that we will remove the employer from that process to a larger degree, and I'll explain why in a moment. But we've talked to employers, most of the employer groups, all of the employer groups I think, and gotten feedback over the last year and a half or so. Employers legitimately highlight that there is a concern around cost base. So there's both direct costs in terms of the new contribution that they'll need to make, but there's also often an indirect cost, certainly at the moment, in terms of investment advice, scheme advice, the administration time and cost of setting people up, and changes to payroll systems and so on. The employers we've spoken to at the lower level who don't currently provide pensions highlight to us we've no HR, we've no IR, we've no admin experience in dealing with this. In fact, we've no payroll in some circumstances, and we don't understand pensions. We don't want to be making choices for individuals who work for us when we have as little knowledge as they do around pensions, and we don't want them coming back to us in a number of years saying, my pension didn't perform, you chose it for me, it's your responsibility. So employers want support in that space. And they're also, of course, concerned about the wider economic impact in terms of a large-scale introduction of automatic enrolment will have an impact on the economy more generally in the short term. It will have a more beneficial effect over the long term, but of course, making long-term decisions can be difficult. So, as I say, in terms of the population we're dealing with, we have 249,000 enterprises in Ireland, 1.4 million employees. 93% of those are micro, between 1 and 10 employers. And if we hark back to the slide I showed you early on, the largest gap in pension provision is amongst those employers. So again, the structure we have is built around accommodating that. So for employers, what the straw man tries to project is that we intend to minimise the administrative burden wherever possible on the employer, and that brings in the CPA, and the CPA will take responsibility and removing the employer from some scheme responsibilities. We'll use scale and technology to reduce service costs for these employers. What we will have to do is introduce a statutory duty, and the statutory duty for the employer will be your responsibility to enrol your employees, and it will be your responsibility to make whatever contributions are considered appropriate. But to a large extent, that's where the significant burden ends. Contributions will be made via payroll to the registered providers using the unique identifier. There would absolutely have to be strong regulatory supports, both from the CPA and likely from the Pensions Authority and regulator. The contributions that would be made would be deductible by the employer for corporation tax purposes, but we absolutely know through evidence building elsewhere, other countries who have introduced it, that it will be crucial all the way through to make sure we continue to engage with employers and understand their difficulties, and they will have challenges, particularly small employers. But overall, we say the critical test for it will be, is it easy to operate for employers? And that's something we hope our design proposal would help achieve. Just a quick word on registered providers. Again, we want to ensure there be a fiduciary duty to act in the best interest of members. This will provide an opportunity for providers with scale. It will have to be large-scale providers in the market perhaps are present, or an amalgamation of them. That's frequently what happens internationally. There's a consortium decide they want to get involved in this space and build services. They'd have to have the capacity and expertise, and we think about 4 is the right number. So we've looked at master trusts or large schemes internationally, and to deliver the type of scale that we're talking about, whilst maintaining a competition between them, we think 100,000 is an appropriate number, 100,000 per scheme as a starter. So that gives us about 4 schemes. Now we're open either side of that, but we absolutely think it should be close. If we look at some schemes in the UK, say Nest or People's Pension, they have 6 million in Nest, 2 million in People's Pension, so really big scale, and that's the point I kind of think is crucial to get across. By international standards, we're an outlier. Scale, 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 scale is the message we have learned from everywhere. Increase your scheme sizes. It's also a fundamental intent of the pensions regulator as it stands, on the same basis, I think, as I'm suggesting. So if we get that scale, account admin, investment management, all of that stuff is made easier and more effective. So in terms of choice for the individual, as I say there, each registered provider as it stands, we're saying you could offer 3 choices, and the parameters will be set by the central processing agency. So you might have 3 choices or 4 choices per provider, where an individual can look at a provider and see a low, medium or higher risk option. And we've set that low number due to what's called information or choice paralysis, where any more is just too much for individuals and they don't make choices. So keep the number low, keep the cost low, but have a default option when the individual doesn't make a choice. So just moving on to the particular parameters, that's kind of through the policy side of things. Who will be in, why, how much and so on. So target membership. Under the strawman proposal, we've said employees aged between 23 and 60 and earning 20,000 plus should be in the system. And that's because we Going back to the policy objective of not having a reduction in living standards at retirement, we definitively believe that that group will suffer a reduction in their living standards if they don't save for retirement, and they aren't currently saving for retirement, so therefore they should be in. We also, however, need to assess membership against current expenditure. So you would have a lot of people who may suffer a reduction in their living standards at retirement, would also say, but I just do not have the capacity to save at the moment. So how do you find a sweet spot between those things, between the objective but also short-term affordability? We also need to watch out for not enrolling the wrong type of people and then early on having mass opt-outs, which may have a contagion effect across the system and encourage others to opt out. So make sure that we have the right people in. So we picked that age, 23, based on the fact that it allows 45 years of savings. 52% of people below the age of 23 are in education or in low earning jobs. There's frequent job churn, as I mentioned, particularly below 22. So at 23, the job churn, people moving from job to job, tends to reduce. So just based on admin burden and so on, we've said 23 is an appropriate age. Based on the contributions in the system as it stands, that group would then be able to achieve the goal of the system. That would see age 23 to 60, 20,000 plus would see about 410,000 people captured, employees at the moment. So that's your starting day population. It also prevents oversaving and, as I say, limits economic opt-out and shock, that 410,000. So what we said for other employees is that they will be able to opt in if they're not in that criteria. And that opt-in number, that's those below 20,000, below 23 and over 60, you'll be talking about a population of about 450,000. Now, if we take the population below state pension, who are on salaries at the moment under the state pension, there's about 255,000 people or so who are on under the state pension. Now, you can imagine enrolling people in a system that are over the long term perhaps earning lower than the state pension and saying to them, we're compelling you to save from a very small income now to try and achieve an income in retirement that we know the state pension is going to be supplementary to your state pension, but your state pension will give you more than you're actually on now. So an individual, why should I save now from a limited income when I know the state pension is going to provide more than that? So that's why that lower earnings group aren't included as it stands. We also have to look at self-employed. There's about 240,000 self-employed who don't save for retirement. We've looked all over the world and we haven't seen an automatic enrolment system which can accommodate the needs of the self-employed population as a starting day operation. Typically the self-employed see their own business as their pension. They try to keep capital as a kind of backstop for the business and they don't in the round like to be interfered with to the same extent or supported, we would say obviously, as employees. So we've said self-employed would be able to opt in rather than being automatically enrolled, and that's on the basis of a successful business isn't always achievable for the self-employed, and often they retire and their capital is themselves and they can't sell that on in terms of their own experience. But we're open and we've asked within the straw man, is there any suggestions that could be made which would allow the system to better accommodate the self-employed? We also, and it's a significant caveat, we need to do further analysis of the population, and that's in terms of gender impact, the type of savers we have in terms of non-nationals and where they are in the income scale, carers, and as I said, the self-employed. So there are particular impacts on particular groups that we need to have a better understanding of as it stands to allow us to make better decisions. Contribution rates, we've said the employer and employee contribution rate would start in 2022 at a low base of 1%. Of up to €75,000, and it would auto-escalate on an annual basis up to 6% of a max in 2027, and that would be a statutory obligation on employers to match. The individual could opt out. If the individual opts out, the employer doesn't have to contribute, but if the individual stays in, the employer has to match them all the way up to 6%, and that would be fundamentally new in Ireland, hasn't existed to this point. There are ambitious contribution rates. We were asked to develop a system to allow an individual, as I've kind of repeated a number of times, not have a reduction in the living standards in retirement. And we've laid out those ambitious contribution rates to say that is it reasonable from a public policy point of view in 10 years' time, 2027, 2028, that we would have contribution rates that we know are required to deliver the type of objective that has been set. And that, again, is open for discussion. In terms of a state bonus, Different population of automatic enrolment employees, many individuals who may be in the system who don't actually pay tax, who absolutely we know don't understand the value of tax relief. So we've said for an AE population, a state saver bonus should be considered as a matching contribution. So for every €3 I put in, it's matched by €1 by the state. So it's a like-for-like contribution up to a prescribed cap. And again, that's fundamentally different from the existing system, and there's been a lot of conversation around it. But we say the automatic enrolment population is a different population to current savers. All of those would be underpinned, as Tim mentioned at the start, by an economic impact analysis. We know an increase in contribution rate for this many people would have an economic impact in terms of GDP, business expansion, employment. We're working with the ESRI at the moment to model that under various scenarios, and that will obviously inform government decisions. What we would absolutely say is that AE must set realistic expectations from the outset. The lower the contribution, the lower the outcome for individuals. So matching kind of ambition with tempering it with realism in terms of what can be achieved. And just coming towards the end here now, investment options, I've kind of gone through that already. As I say, 4 providers, 3 standard fund options. I think we've said publicly in some of the consultation for you we have, the department isn't by any means a centre for pensions investment specialism. That work will be done later on to decide how should these funds be structured by low, moderate and medium risk. Typically speaking, default funds internationally operate on the basis of the earlier you are in your working life, the more you're invested in equities and risk-based assets, and the closer you get to retirement, that risk is moderated. We've said clearly it's not necessarily a second-order issue, but it's an issue that will be decided a little bit later on. But basically, those funds will need to have a look at the risk-reward profile. So what's the appropriate level of benefit that we're targeting, what's the competitive cost for delivering a fund, and what's the acceptable level of risk. And there's always going to be a trade-off there, because there is an element of risk in DC retirement savings. What we do know is, say in the UK, 6 million members in their Nest fund, 37% of members wanted no risk whatsoever with their retirement savings. Now what we need to do is understand that and accept that individuals have free choice, but also highlight that risk is two-ended. You may have safety in the fact that your money that you put into a retirement savings pot is risk-free, but that attaches itself risk at the far end, that when you hit retirement, your money hasn't worked for you and you have far less to see you through your 20-odd years of retirement that you had anticipated. So what's the appropriate risk-reward demand profile for individuals? As I say, 90% of people will go into that default, so it would be, if the state's involved to the extent that we're suggesting, it would be absolutely critical that that default is designed correctly, totally critical. Moving on to opt-outs and re-enrolments. Kind of crucial in terms of the window of opt-out for individuals. So we know, again, through international evidence, we're kind of last in class, to be frank, to introduce this system, and one of the benefits is that you gain from the learning of other countries. And we know that opt-out windows that are kept short and that are delayed a little to allow an individual to see their statement and see the benefit prevents kind of knee-jerk out reactions. So if I get a statement and I've put €100 in myself, and I see my employers put €100 and the state's put in 33, I have 233 as opposed to 100. When I get that sense of understanding, it increases the rates of retention within the scheme. So opt-outs are low. So as I say, in the UK, 11 million enrollees, over 1 million employers, 90% have stayed in the system, of savers who wouldn't previously have decided to save. So we say within the straw man, maintain the opt-out during the 7th and 8th month. After you get your initial statement, see the benefit, then you can opt out. If you do opt out, you get your benefits back. We also say that you would then be re-enrolled every year. Again, every 3 years. Looking internationally, we've seen that people make temporary choices due to short-term demands. The environment will change in terms of AE acceptability will broaden, and there will be a kind of peer group acceptance of automatic enrolment, and people will decide they need to be in because everyone else is in. We also know in the UK, of the 10% who opted out, after 3 years they were re-enrolled, and over 50% stayed in. So it's worth it, effectively. In terms of saving suspension periods, some systems internationally look at allowing individuals period of not saving. So you may have childcare costs, you may have healthcare costs, you may have unforeseen costs that you want to say, I just need to stop for 6 months or whatever period of time and then restart. We say within the document we'd like to hear views on that. What we need to be very careful of is compromising our own goals in terms of allowing people out of the system and then again through inertia that they don't go back in. So we say if they are considered, there should be a nudge back into the system, but also we should be very careful of them. So we know in New Zealand, for instance, that allow long periods of saving suspension up to 5 years, 40% of its automatic enrolled population are on periods of saving suspension. So it can lead to unintended behavioural sort of changes. So caution, I suppose, is our watchword on it. And now finishing up, benefits of the payout stage. I suppose, again, one of the key lessons internationally we've learned is our objective is around an adequate pension. It's also around a sustainable pension, that you have a payment over the period of your entire retirement, a traditional pensions idea. And that's why in the policy objective we have a provision of income for the duration of the retirement years. So what sort of structure could provide that? Our international lesson, again from every system we've looked at, is make sure you get this accumulation stage, as they call it, where you're drawing your income. Make sure you get it right from the outset and that it's coherent with your accumulation, your savings phase. Has been a major problem in other jurisdictions. That rolls off the tongue easily, to be frank, but it's a really challenging thing to do. And that will require that we re-look at the options that are available to people in retirement. So at the moment you have a lump sum, an improved retirement fund which you can draw down at your own behest, and you have annuities. We know absolutely now that almost the complete majority of savers outside of defined benefit schemes, defined contribution savers, are going for approved retirement funds rather than annuities. It's because annuities are costly. But approved retirement funds bring investment risk and bring other risks, and most particularly bring longevity risk, that I will bomb out my money and spend it all before I hit my most vulnerable years. So you might hit 75 or 80, you might have increased healthcare costs or whatever other cost, and you may be in a position where you're being less and less cognitively able to make decisions around your financial future, and you bomb out your money. So what sort of structure should we have to provide security on that income stream over the long term? So internationally there would be things like deferred annuities, where you purchase an annuity that you only draw down when you're 80, and it's much more cost competitive or cost efficient, and you know then when you hit that most vulnerable stage in your life, or more vulnerable stage, that you have an income backstop. In short, really a lot of work to do on that, and we've largely just invited views on it. The Department of Finance is undertaking a review at the moment in terms of the provision of approved retirement funds and the degree to which they're fit for purpose and should be changed, and that will hopefully inform our own processes, but a large piece of work. So that, to a degree, is it. It's a kind of quick run through, to be frank. We could speak forever on almost any element of that straw man. It's a policy proposal which, again, as Tim said, what we wanted to do was anchor the debate around themes that we know are crucial for the system. We don't believe it's perfect, but we do believe it is approximately the right line of flight for a system such as this. And you can see the timelines there in terms of our discussions. The straw man itself, the consultation will close on November 4th. We're currently travelling the country to deliver a regional consultation for it, and we've had all sorts of other meetings and briefings with interest groups and representative groups, employers, trade unions and so on. So a large degree of consultation and a lot of work to do once we finish it up.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nicholson and Mr. Duggan. Just before I take questions, I have one or two technical points we just want clarity on. First of all, I just want to make one observation. The second last slide, you indicated benefits in the payout phase. That's hugely important that people understand that. It's one of the largest reasons that people don't take pensions. They don't have confidence in what's going to be there at the end of the day. So that, the clarity and the narrative and the description that goes around it is really, really important. I just want to confirm one or 2 points. You indicated twice during the presentation the reason you looked at who the target group was, and you said from 23 to 60, effectively the 23-year-olds would have 45 years, so that's 68. Is that the earliest that is envisaged for pension drawdown, the age of 68?
So we suggest the payment drawdown should be the prevailing state pension age. So be it 66, 67 or 68, whatever the prevailing state pension age is at the time.
Well, by the time somebody accumulates a pot, it will be 60.
Yes, that's 43 years, absolutely.
But there is no option, so there is no provision if somebody exits the workforce at 62, 65 to draw down a reduced pension or anything like that?
Not as it stands. What we say is the drawdown conditions would take cognizance of ill health and so on. So if there's an ill health, as is currently the case, there would be. But at the moment, we've put it in the straw man as age, the prevailing state pension age, long-term 68.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify. Secondly, the 6%, eventually it'll be 6%. You indicated that the contribution level was 1% increasing annually to 6%. 6% for the employer, 6% for the employee, and 2% for the state. Is there any facility for an employee who feels they can't afford the 6% but could afford a reduced payment, or is it set at 6%?
So at the moment in the straw man it's set at 6% auto escalation with the option for the individual to opt out early
Not
doors.
reduced?
Not reduced in the straw man. There is countries internationally that do allow people, they auto escalate under legislation, but if an individual actively makes a decision for themselves that I can't cope with this, they can come to a stop. But in the straw man, we suggest nudge all the way up. Okay. Again, it's a subject of what we want to hear back from people in terms of whether it's sustainable or not.
If I'm not mistaken from the straw man, the contribution from the employer is tax deductible against corporation tax.
Yes.
The contribution of the employee, is there tax relief on that?
No, that's contribution from gross, a percentage contribution from gross, which will then be matched. So effectively the matching replaces the tax relief in the straw man for the automatic enrolment population. We're not commenting on the wider pensions environment, and the Department of Finance is currently chairing a group looking at doing an assessment of wider tax relief as part of the roadmap for pensions reform. We're talking specifically about the automatic enrolment population, and it's a matching con, not tax relief.
So there'll be winners and losers. If somebody had been traditionally on the 20%, they'll be doing better, getting 1 in 3. Whereas if they were on 50,000, and the scheme is for those between 20 and 75,000, somebody who might be on 50,000 would currently be paying the top rate, will do marginally less well.
Well,
changing to the state contribution rather than tax relief, is that correct?
yeah, but if they're in a pension scheme, they won't be targeted for auto-enrolment. So that wouldn't arise. If they changed from a pension scheme they're currently in and became part of auto-enrolment, and we haven't worked out how that might work yet, then obviously that would arise. But that would be based on a choice that an individual had made, and what they may be getting by going into auto-enrolment that they're not getting in a private pension arrangement is the employer contribution. So they would have to do their own sums if they were in that type of situation.
Sorry for delaying the meeting.
But we're not concerned about those people because they've already made choices and they understand pensions to a certain extent. We're targeting the people who have nothing.
And if they were migrating from, they had established a pot, and because obviously, you quite clearly define who you're looking at. Some people out there will have pensions and they'd be inadequate. If they wanted to migrate into auto-enrolment, does the pot that they've already accumulated migrate in, or does it run its course?
Yeah, both are possible, and as I said, we haven't yet worked out how, if we will allow integration of that nature, and if we do, how that would be done. Because you would be talking about two disparate systems in the sense one had a matching con and the other had a tax relief element to it. So how would that be dealt with subsequently at drawdown phase and so on? So there are things like that to be worked out, but we consider them more second order issues rather than...
I've one final question. It's a little bit complicated because pensions generally are. In your opening statement on one of the slides, you indicated that for average earnings, the figure you used was 38,000, and somebody who gets the state pension currently would get 34% of that figure. You remember that slide?
Yeah.
Okay. And you then went on to say the department reckons that to maintain the correct standard, they need 60%. Yeah? Yeah. The question I want to ask you is, when the scheme is operational, so not in the initial phases at the 1%, but say somebody is paying 6%, 6%, and they're paying for the 45 years, okay? what percentage would that give in that scenario? In other words, what I'm trying to, has it been worked out that that will make up the difference?
Yes, and it will. So we have run actuarial calculations. Now, actuarial calculations by their nature are assumptions in terms of inflation, investment return and so on, but based on actuarial standards, we've run calculations, and you'll see there the average earnings 38, as you say. State pension provides 34%, and we seek 60 in the round. And we know, based on the contribution rates over the savings periods that we have, that an individual will achieve that level of income in retirement. So broadly, that's why we set the contribution rates as we set them. It's a rule of thumb within industry. Somewhere between 14 and 17% of your income needs to be contributed to hit income target replacement rates, and we know that's effectively why we've set them.
So the state pension would still provide 34%, and you're saying then that 26% will come from auto enrolment, and the combination is your 60%.
Yes. Yeah.
And the actuarial calculations
back that up.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Sorry for that. That was a bit complicated, but Deputy Brady.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks to the guys for coming in, and thanks, Robert, for that comprehensive presentation. I suppose the public in general, by and large, what I'm hearing, are oblivious to all of this, and I suppose the consultation period is still open up until the 4th of November. So I suppose the first question I have is, what kind of uptake in that consultation? And many submissions have been made to date. Because I don't think that the public are aware of, this is going to be a seismic shift in policy in terms of pension provision going forward, and it will pose some challenges for certainly some sectors of society. And I suppose the earning ceiling that is set in the straw man of 20,000, if you go to, I think it's the third graph there, and it goes through all the different employment types. The first three on the graph there shows accommodation, food services, administration, service or support services, and the retail trade. And they're the three areas that primarily, you have low pay, you have precarious employment, 0-hour contracts. And I think it's self-evident as to why there is such a low uptake there, and a lot of those areas will fit into that category. The 20,000. And there are concerns there around that bar and which people will be auto-enrolled. If we did achieve a living wage, which I think we should be trying to work towards, I would be critical of the increase in the minimum wage announced in the budget just gone. I think it's not going to move people anywhere near where they need to be in terms of having a real living wage, but that's Shin Scale Ella. That's another debate. But how fixed is that date or that bar in the straw man that was announced? I'd have some concerns around that. So just get some insight into that. Just in relation to, I suppose, the employer's contribution, the state's contribution. You made a remark, Robert, that you said at least that was going to be the case initially. Now, I'm not sure what you meant by that, whether at some point that is going to cease to be the case, or whether that's being looked at, that after 10 years, after 15 years, that the state will stop their contribution and the employer. So I'm not sure as to what you meant by that, so maybe you might elaborate on that. There was, I think it's important that, look, it's very difficult for people to invest into something that maybe 35, 40 years away without actually seeing on an annual basis what's in the pot for them at that moment in time, and ultimately what the provision is going to be. And I know some service providers actually operate app systems that people can log in at any stage, and I know this is more the nuts and the bolts as opposed to the actual broader policy provision. I'm not sure as to whether something like that can be looked at, that people, an app that people could have a look at, see, and I suppose real current time as to what would be in it for them. I suppose you mentioned the self-employed and the big challenges there. I think you gave a figure of 260,000 self-employed people not having private pension provision, and that poses challenges. Absolutely it does. And we had a conversation before yourselves came in here around bogus self-employment, and I think that's key to the challenge here, is addressing the huge level of bogus self-employment that's out there, and you know, if that isn't tackled, we'll see again employers getting away with, you know, providing a pension provision for their employees when this auto enrolment rolls out. Just a couple of concerns I have, and maybe you might be able to, I suppose, answer this, that on the 7th, 8th month, people can decide to opt out. And there have been different figures bandied about since the consultation opened in August as to how much that would actually cost someone, you know, as to whether there will be a maintenance charge imposed on people up until that point, and how much ultimately, you know, if you're dealing with someone, say, on the straw man, on an income of 20,000, and they decide, you know, reasonably that, you know, they cannot afford, you know, to opt into this. You know, they're struggling to put bread on the table as it is. They're automatically enrolled into this. They can't afford it and they opt out. How much will it cost them to opt out after the 7th, 8th month? And again, 3 years later, they're automatically enrolled. You know, they simply can't afford it. You know, they're not looking 40 years down the road, 30 years down the road. They're looking at trying to put bread on the table for their family. So, in real terms, how much will it cost those people to opt out? And the last question here, and I think this is the biggest question in my mind, one of the most important questions, as to who will manage this overall, as to whether it's going to be the private sector or as to whether it's going to be the state who will ultimately manage this. Because the fear I have here is, you know, look, having the private sector, I think already they're rubbing their hands with the thoughts of this, even though you're saying, you know, it's only going to be about 0.5% because of the scale. You know, initially, 4 different providers we're talking about, probably 100,000, you know, in each of those providers, but they are ultimately rubbing their hands. But, you know, the critical question is overall, who is going to manage this? So maybe you might be able to give some indication.
Thank you, Deputy Brady. I'm going to get the answers to each speaker because some of the questions are more technical rather than general discussion points. So
I just really want to ask one question, so maybe they could take it up, because a lot of them have been asked already. Just can I ask you to expand on the 4 registered providers, the varying risk, the low and moderate and medium? What are you talking about? Because many people just want to know that at the end of the day, when they leave work, retire, that their stable fund is there, and that's what really the trust around the austerity and the collapse in the markets and everything, that people just lost whole pensions. So I think that's, you know,
right. From the top, I suppose, in terms of the consultation process, there's a list there of the activity that we've been involved in to date. So we've run national and local media radio ads. We've full briefing on our website. We've had regional consultation for it. We've already had 2 in Dublin. We're due in Cork and Galway next week. I have to be frank and say that that's largely been attended by pensions boffins, if I could put it that way, and not members of the public. And we always suspected that, to be frank. For a reform that's coming into place in 2022, there's not generally a huge amount of interest in what's going on here and now. What we are doing to accommodate that, and we've already run some quite a while ago now, but we have run them, is focus groups of likely members of an automatic enrolment system. So we look at the profile of individuals, we bring 10 or 12 of them together in a room over 4 or 6 occasions, and we ask them to kind of their views on the trust issues, concerns, what type of product would you like, why would you like it, what if it had this impact, and model the system with them basically. So that's where we're trying to build up our intelligence there. A lot of work to do still in it, to be frank. We're literally just drawing our ideas together.
Yeah, the Minister is very keen that members of the public would turn up, and she keeps saying it. But the difficulty is we haven't yet found a way to make pensions exciting enough for people to give up a piece of their day to come along to. And that's been our experience down through the years, no matter what the topic. On pensions, it's very difficult to get ordinary people to turn up and pay attention to it. We did have some at the Dublin Forum, which was very interesting, and it was quite informative actually, because while industry and practitioners and boffins, as Rob says, will take a particular line, it's interesting to see how an ordinary person views it from their perspective and what they'll say. So we dearly would love, and if you can use your good offices to get people to come along to the roadshows, we'd be thrilled to see them, because we really genuinely want to hear what normal people have to say rather than those with vested interests.
In terms of submissions, the closing date for the straw man submissions, and it is particularly the straw man because we're going to consult right on after that with everybody we can, but for the straw man, I'm not exactly sure the number. Most of the submissions from at the moment are from individuals, and they would be fairly short. There's probably about 30 or 40 of them. We really strongly anticipate that there will be a flood of submissions in and around the last week. Almost, but again, that would be likely from employer reps, employee reps, pensions industry, and some of the strong advocate groups. I think many of the individuals that we're going to get, we probably have already gotten. In terms of target population, what we try to do with the target population that's set out in the straw man is these people should definitively be in the system. What we've also put in the document is strong consideration should be given to that 20,000 threshold. And we've highlighted in particular the group in between 14 and 20. So from a policy point of view, the objective is maintaining living standards. And if we know the state pension is 13,000 plus secondary benefits, we know everybody on incomes below that are going to achieve the objective of the system without being put in the system, because the state pension will reduce over 100% of their income. Now, we either need to change the objective or else of the system, or else say that that group shouldn't naturally be included, but allow them to include themselves if they choose to be. The 14 to 20,000 is probably the most interesting space. So for instance, from the gender perspective, we know that about 150,000 women who don't currently save for retirement will be covered in the 20,000 and above space. But the further down you go below that, women disproportionately are disproportionately accounted for compared to males, because they're on lower earnings, time out of the workforce and so on. So the lower down the income scale you go, the more you might hit particular groups. We haven't full data on that yet, but we're looking at, if it reflects the UK, the gender issue, ethnic minorities and people with disabilities who have different work patterns generally and sit at that kind of low earning space. So we've said, and we've asked for views on all of those things in the straw man, and asked for views particularly on whether people between 13 and 20,000 should be introduced. What we need to balance that with is short-term affordability. Would people on those wages opt out of the system and create a kind of wider contagion? Would they say, I just don't have the capacity to save at the moment? So where's the sweet spot? There's probably no single answer, to be frank. Wherever we fit, it will impact some who don't want to be impacted and not impact others who would like to be impacted. So it's as much of an educated position as we can get. In terms of you referred to me referring to an employer con initially. I'm not quite sure what I was referring to be frank. The principle is that once this system is rolled out, employers and the state will continue to make contributions for the duration.
You made that comment that I kind of, my ears
frightened you.
Forever. Change the word initially to forever. And you're there.
In terms of data for individuals and being able to see their contributions and so on, absolutely. There's all sorts of fintech, financial technology platforms out there at the moment that do all sorts of things for individuals on their mobile phones, on their TVs at home, to allow them see and project in a very colourful way from a communications point of view what impact their savings is having over the longer term. We would see that as a fundamental part of the system. An extra benefit would be, and we got this from New Zealand, in some systems, an individual, and in Ireland as it stands, doesn't necessarily see their contribution being removed from payroll and into the pension scheme. As a result, during the financial crisis, for instance, some employers got themselves into sticky situations where the employees' con didn't hit their pension pot. Using this system with a central processing agency and real-time data from revenue, which will come in January 2019, an individual will be able to track their money, through the CPA and into the fund, they'll be able to see it for themselves and they'll be able to log in. So communications and technology, absolutely a central element of it. In terms of self-employed, again, 240,000 people. So only 30% of the self-employed population have pensions. A very difficult group to get a real understanding of, because one self-employed person is entirely different from another in terms of how their business is structured, what sort of capital requirements they have and so on. All I can say is no system we've looked at has managed to cater within the kind of orthodox main system for self-employed, but we are asking for ideas on that. I think we would see the issue of bogus self-employment as perhaps a more employment law related issue and should be addressed through that, and if they are genuinely employees, then be captured within the automatic enrolment system. But totally something to keep an eye on, and something other jurisdictions have struggled with, to be frank. In terms of the individual maintenance charge, as it's structured at the moment, the individual goes into the system. If they opt out after 7 or 8 months, they get their contribution back less the maintenance charge. Now, the reason for that is it's more expensive to reroute that very small maintenance charge as it would stand back to the individual from the fund to the CPA back to the individual. If we imagine somebody on 25,000 a year, and that's the population that we're talking about, making 1% of contribution, and a 0.5% of that 1% goes to a charge, you're talking less than €1 or marginally more than €1 in terms of a charge after 7 or 8 months. So you can see administratively there's not really a reason to be handing that back, because it would cost more to do it than it would to be actually of value to the individual. And the cost, the administrative cost of doing it, would have to fall to somebody, and it would likely fall to the members, the other members who stay in the system, because the CPA would likely have to be self-financing to a degree.
Just on that point, and look, I know you can't, I suppose, speak to reports over the summer or whatever. There was some indicators that maintenance charge could be up to 70, 80 euro. You're saying absolutely not. I don't know whether you're seeing those reports or not. But
no, well, what we've said is it would be 0.5% of an individual's contribution, and if they're staying only for the first 6 or 7 months. And we know that the wage that people are on are typically lower earners, you can see that it would be a very small, it's literally single euro. So there would be no intent from the perspective that we're taking on the straw man to have it up at that level. It might reach that level later on in the system when an individual is on higher earnings and making 6%, but they're staying in the system, so they're paying for the service that they're getting. But again, compared to current charging structures, this is very, very different. Very different.
Somebody would have to be saving, I think, about 14,000 a year for that to be true. That'd be some saving. Yeah, and I doubt
75,000.
exactly. I doubt we'd be hugely worried about them, to be honest. Yeah.
Mr. Nicholson, the point also that Deputy Collins, the security of the fund and the different...
Yeah, and there was a general question in terms of who manages the system as well. So effectively the CPA, as I think I said earlier on, would be there to look after the individual's interest in the first place. So setting the standards, asking providers who have significant scale and the capacity to deliver to tender to deliver this service. So they would set the standards, around the number of funds, how the funds would be broadly structured, how charges and so on are presented to the individual, so one is readily comparable in another. So the quality assurance aspect would be looked after by the CPA. The regulator, as the Pensions Authority, would ensure legal compliance with whatever legislation is in place. That's the principle. Just in terms of scale and sort of suggestion that there is a ready body of financial providers out there ready to, well, I think as you said yourself, Deputy, wring in their hands. At those charges, it is a really competitive service to deliver. So we know that, and we need to model this a little bit further, but we know, looking at international systems, large providers generally get involved in this space with an element of they have to, because they see the line of sight over 20, 30, 40 years. And they know if they're not involved, that it's not the best place for their business. But we also know they need to make large capital outlays initially to build the systems to accommodate this. So frequently early on they are loss making, and they look at commercial capacity over the longer term, not the short term. So there's been a lot of interest in the document. We say you'll have 4 providers initially, but after 5, 7 or 10 years it'll be retendered and best in show will get the action. So registered providers would say to us, well, we may not have enough time over that 5, 6, 7 years early doors to actually make it commercially viable. So how do we structure to achieve those two things? And we've looked at data which would, as I say, highlight that a large capital outlay is required. And that's also why we say within the document that each provider would have a statutory duty to deliver services to all comers. Because effectively we know if somebody on 5,000 or 6,000 or 10,000 decides to opt into the system, they're loss making to the provider. But we've said the totality of the system, you have to provide services. So again, a lot of work to do, and we intend to build up intelligence over the next number of months and have a much closer look at the admin systems similar that they run in Sweden, Malaysia, New Zealand and a couple of other states, to look at them and see exactly where that role should start and finish. But the intention is to make all of these decisions in the best interest of members. And again, that's why we go to the idea of the fiduciary responsibility of the providers that will actually be operating the system. So we've looked at, there's recently been a Royal Commission, for instance, in Australia. It sounds like it's far away, but their systems are actually quite similar. And the Royal Commission in Australia, who looked at the whole financial services, it's a services system, delivering pensions, would have raised questions around that structure, the fiduciary duty versus large insurance companies or banks and so on providing services, and they would have raised questions over decisions that may not have been made by those large private institutions in the same way if they were trust-based schemes, if I could put it that way, and concerns around costs and poorer outcomes for the individuals. So we've said we need a structure, which we don't have at the moment in Ireland, to try and marry those two things, a contract between the individual and the provider, but at the same time a fiduciary responsibility. And we think, hopefully, we have enough imagination to try and come up with a structure along those lines. In terms of those, Deputy, on the funds, as I say, at the moment we table low, medium and moderate risk, and that is really to kind of just project the idea that that risk goes two ways, as I've said. You can put your money effectively in the bank or under the bedspread, and it'll be there on your retirement. But the problem is that you need, if you have 20 years in retirement and you want to for yourself achieve a level of adequacy that goes beyond that saving, you need to make it work for you. And also, as a broader economy, we need to make sure that money is working to generate income for ourselves and for the income for the economy more broadly. So typically speaking, pension funds would have an element of investment around them. Now, of course, if an individual outright doesn't want to do that, there should be a choice for them there to do that. But typically speaking, there would be at least, certainly early on in the career, working career, investments in equities to generate a return that provides that type of adequacy. Finding the right balance between those two things and understanding what an individual actually wants is a job that hasn't been done yet and needs to be done. But as I say, risk goes two ways, not just protecting your capital cash, but protecting the chance of achieving what you want to achieve. To an extent, that's down to a qualified decision by the individual themselves, and of course that's around the education and making sure that when we make default choices that an individual understands what they're getting themselves into to the best we can make it.
Thank you. Senator Higgins.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Mr. Nicholson. I think we first talked about this about 4 or 5 years ago in a completely different hat, I remember, and I do recognise, I think it is one of the policy areas where a lot of very considered thought has gone in. I think there's a lot of really strong and positive aspects to some of the proposals. I also quite like the straw man as one part of that consultation. I think compared to the total contribution consultation of the summer, I thought wasn't as clear for people. I know people found it very hard to navigate in terms of what they were looking at and what was actually being asked, whereas I found this, it kind of sets out some of the key decision points and people can see where the thinking is at in a very clear way, and I think that's useful. From my perspective, I guess I'm thinking of it, as you say, in the first tier, second tier, and almost what I'll call the third tier, which isn't quite, but the tax relief space. I think the priority has to be the first tier and the fixing of our first tier system. I reckon that's coming in 2020, and I guess some of my points will go to how do we ensure that the focus on what may be, I think, a very positive scheme in this regard doesn't take away from our commitment in terms of delivering really on the first tier, especially given, as we know, I think approximately 50% of all women workers are on 20,000 or less, so they're almost falling out of this already. So you have a huge amount of workers. So that question of adequacy and what is adequate and what we consider adequate in terms of replacement income. I think you were saying, I think it's about a 37% replacement rate or 33%. The replacement rate that we have now within the first tier, I think we need to continue to have an ambition for that to go up a little bit so that it's doing a better job of delivering the question of adequacy. And I think it would be very, very important that this scheme be in no way used as a rationale to kind of take away the pressure of adequacy that should be there in both our contributory and non-contributory first-tier pension scheme. And I think it will actually give confidence to people if it's married alongside an ambition to kind of continue. And I think it's been spoken before about, do we benchmark, or how do we basically keep that conversation of adequacy and that expectation of adequacy? Because I think I have noticed in some of the rhetoric around it, not from yourself, but that there's been a slippage of, well, if you want an adequate income replacement, you need to have this. I think let's treat this as an additional, which would be a very positive additional for most people. And then to move to the other side of the second tier system, and I'll come to my just really specific questions on the system itself. The thing that we need to look at is, it's not a matter of, I think it was mentioned as is it a question for the individual or whatever, whether those who are already in tax relief schemes and so forth. There is a tension here because this is an expensive scheme that has been put in place, and it's a good scheme, I think. But if it is put in place, something needs to give, and what needs to give must not be the first tier or any other part of the social protection budget. What has to give is our current tax relief system, because I think we saw it so starkly there. It's those on 60,000 and 70,000 who are benefiting most from the marginal rate tax relief at the moment. You spoke about the less commercially viable aspect of going for of supporting lower income earners in schemes, and the fact of the market failure. We need to be honest, the state has created an environment in which it is less commercially viable because the state has rewarded pension systems and pension schemes for targeting higher earners, because the marginal rate tax relief, the 40% or whatever that they get, is so much higher. There's a huge supplement there. So we have, for really a couple, decades now, incentivised pension schemes to go after and support and push for higher earners. And you can see it in the advertisements from the schemes themselves, who they're targeting, who they're reaching out to. So I think if we want to ensure that there is that positive, we do need to address that tension. And I think, there is a long lead-in time here, but that lead-in time needs to be accompanied by a shift away from the marginal rate tax relief that we give at the moment, which costs, I think it was 2.6 billion is what we pay out in marginal rate tax relief at the moment. And I think that's just important. I think, Mr. Duggan, you mentioned you wouldn't be too concerned about those who are on 13 or 14,000, but at the moment people can put up to 30,000 effectively, through the tax relief system in a year. And that's, so I think, just if we're really honest, because this is where this scheme, which I think is I genuinely actually think is the right way for us to go, something does need to live, and we cannot have that sit alongside the tax relief system. There's going to be a pressure between them, and I think we need to, if we are looking at a supplementary system, it should be this rather than this plus a scheme that works for the highest earners only. Practical questions that I have. I'm concerned just around that question of risk and where risk sits. Again, I know you were talking about risk working both ways, but the question is not just what ways risk works, the question is where it sits. To what extent will those schemes who are coming in, if we know that people want security, will those firms that are tendering for this, which is the future, and this is the next 30 or 40 years of 50 years, 60 years of whatever, of private pensions engaging with them, will they not take some part of that risk? Because we know that in 2008, there was a 33% fall in pension values. People have memories, and they remember that many people were, the OECD reported that as the figure in Ireland at the time. The risk needs to sit with the company to an extent. I don't think the risk should be sitting with the individual. And if it's not going to sit with the company, then we have to say to what extent does the state underpin the risk? Again, there's a question, should there be a public option amongst the 4 options of providers that are produced? For example, would it even otherwise, another thing that has been spoken about, useful to have, for example, a credit union option. So we almost have one option which is effectively a saving scheme with some level of fallback rather than purely an investment scheme. The question on the fiduciary duty that you mentioned, again, there's that question of how that sits with risk. And my one concern in relation to that is, for example, given that the scheme is going to be heavily subsidised by the state, if we look to things like environmental or social considerations, if we look to, as a state, for example, deciding we don't want to invest in arms, we don't want to invest in fossil fuels, and we know that there's fossil fuel divestment, for example, moving through the Oireachtas at the moment, you know, what is the scope and how does that fiduciary duty sit alongside and ensuring that there is also a responsiveness in a scheme that public monies are going into in terms of the better ethical standards. And I think also that's something that many people would want, you know, maybe not as all the option, perhaps as the default and as one of the options. I know it's something of real concern to many individuals. The questions of the redistributive element, again, that is one of our policy goals in pensions, you know, that is one of the functions to an extent of it. I guess I'm a little bit, the corporate tax, which employers can use, I'm just wondering why the decision is it that all of the contribution can be written off as corporate tax? And is that against corporate tax? And is that then not the case that effectively the state is subsidising both the employer and the state contribution? And I'm just wondering about that decision to be all. I mean, I can understand a portion of it or a portion of it. Also, mechanisms around, and this is a real concern we've seen in bogus self-employment, where employers may press an employee to opt out. That concern. What are the mechanisms around ensuring that they can't be pressed out? The questions I had of the gaps in employment. So where you have not just low wages, but you have many people are in situations of precarious work where people are moving in and out of schemes. How is that managed? Does that simply add up towards the end? I would very much concur with the Chair's point. I think it's a really good point of, I would question about whether we need to tie this to the pension age. At a certain point, effectively, these are contributions. It's a different, slightly different scheme. So I would wonder, I think one of the things that might make it very enticing to people is if they knew that there would be an option at 60 to stop paying in and to get this out. And it would become almost be giving an additional incentive to persons who might know that they are not going to work to 68, or that their employment, you know, if they're a firefighter or whatever they are, isn't going to facilitate it. So, you know, I know that's a different, because that's a public employment, but, you know, as an example. The question of the capped matching. You mentioned that there would be a cap on the matching funds from the state, and just indicating where that cap, I think that's a good idea, by the way. Again, it addresses the fact that this scheme should be delivering what our original pension goals as a state has set out in our pension policy papers for many decades are, which is to bring those persons, the widest net of people in, rather than simply to give a higher benefit to the highest earner. So I think the capped matching is a good idea, but just wondering where the thinking is on it, what its sitting is. I'm sorry, I'll come to the last thing is, yeah, that question, who will manage the central processing authority at the end of the day, if there is a problem, if a scheme goes bust, if things fall through, where does the risk, where does the final responsibility sit? Who underwrites this?
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Duggan or Mr. Nicholson, or both of you?
Maybe I'll start going from the back. The CPA, it's envisaged, would be a statutory agency and would report into a government department. The degree to which that would underpin the savings of individuals, and maybe I'll come on to this, is perhaps a different question, but in terms of its overall responsibility, it would be a statutory agency responsible to a government department. In terms of access, age of access, we put in 68 based on the fact that retirement savings are really around trying to provide for individuals to cover their living costs and continue their income in retirement. And we know that people are living to an average age of 82 or so. A slight gender difference, but 82 or so. So we took the principle that if individuals save to try and achieve that objective, it's reasonable if they're being funded by the state and employers to maintain the spending of that in the retirement window. Now, we're open as to what that is, to be frank. We just thought it was a nice hook to link it to the state pension age in the kind of cultural norm of retirement. But we're open to discussing it.
We're also conscious that even though the averages are kind of in the low 80s, lots of people now, it's not unusual for somebody to be 30 years in retirement, even after state pension age. Lots of people getting into the 90s and even beyond. And therefore what we're trying to do is go back to the original objective, which is coverage and adequacy in retirement. right?
That argument works both ways. If the average is 82 and some are living well into their 90s, others are not. Because the average is 82. So the converse of that argument is that somebody, for whatever reason in their earlier 60s, may have to, and you did allude to it, there may be a health reason or whatever. But
there are also people not even getting to retirement that impact on that
sure.
average, right? So you can have a very long discussion about that, but we do have to be mindful of the fact that lots more people are living a lot longer in retirement than was the case heretofore, and consequently any system we put in place has to facilitate that longevity in retirement.
I suppose the point some of us would be making, Mr. Duggan, is that our experience as the pension age is getting older, we're meeting more and more of our constituents who are having that gap from finishing work before they get the state pension. And there's a concern they're finishing at 65, and some of them may be a bit younger, but they're finishing at 65, they're not getting the pension. There's the gap for 2 or 3 years. For some people, they might be looking at this as an interim measure while they wait. They might have some savings from when they leave work, but they're having difficulty coping till they get to pension age.
And it is fundamentally different from the state system in that it's not a set amount that will come through. You know, it'll reflect what has been saved and what has been put through. So it is a little bit of a different.
Anyway, sorry.
Yeah, as I say, I think we're open to discussion on it, certainly. In terms of the question of in and outs for people with frequent job changes, one of the most beneficial parts of the system is that traditionally when people leave work and join another employer, there's a window before the employer registers with the system because it's administratively difficult. What we said with the CPA is, because you have a unique identifier, from day one when you join your new employment and you can begin contributing, and the employer and the state can begin paralleling that contribution. So it will allow a much more continuous pattern of saving for a population that changes jobs frequently. Having said that, if you're out of the system, it's an earnings-related system. If you're out of the system and you're not contributing, a contribution won't go in. So it'll certainly increase savings persistency, and it'll shorten the window where many employees aren't saving for retirement. But if you're not in work, as it stands under the system, you won't be making contributions. Now, we've asked in the straw man, should we be accommodating people outside of work and how would that be done, and asked for views. Well, as it stands, it's an earnings-related system. In terms of employer compliance, we've again looked at a lot of states internationally, and non-compliance isn't as big an issue as you would have imagined. That said, there's always unscrupulous people in every field. As it stands, we have an administrative sanction suggested within the straw man, and if that administrative sanction doesn't work, a criminal sanction. So we would be confident that we will be in the round to be able to ensure compliance, but it does require the likes of the pensions regulator to get involved and to have appropriate compliance facilities in. Again, one of the benefits of the CPA is centrally we would be able to have an element of compliance in that employers would be legally obliged, whether the individual is in the system or not, to register their employees who haven't pensions coverage and their details. So there would be a transparency there. In terms of fund types, absolutely, it's an issue for discussion in terms of what's an appropriate fund type, and we would see the CPA as having that role. So for instance, in the UK and Australia and so on, you have ESG or environmental and social rules governing the structure of pension funds, and it's actually part of an EU directive which we obviously adhere to, the IORPS directive. So stuff like ARMS, in the UK they have Sharia funds, funds not investing in the likes of tobacco companies and that kind of thing. So absolutely it would feature in terms of how funds are structured. Risk, where does it sit? I have to say it's been decided as it stands that it's a personal pot and it's a defined contribution basis. So as it stands, the individual decides the level of risk that they want to administer. So at the moment, the first pillar pension is where the state suggests in its own right, we will guarantee this level of pension, and that's the fiscal risk the state takes on your behalf and redistributes income. Personal saving is about saving what's appropriate for you, and the state will support you in doing that. But the risk in this system from a DC point of view would lie with the individual. And then we get into the situation of, well, how much risk does that individual want to take? If they want to just put it in the bank or the post office and take no risk whatsoever, they can do that. There would perhaps be no need, if that was the ideal thing for everyone to do, there'd probably be no need for this system, because we just legislate to say that everybody should be in a post office account and save a certain amount of money. So we probably wouldn't be sitting here in front of you.
Just because the incentive is the fact that people won't save and they don't save, and all of these incentives are put, for example, around the matching from the employer, around the matching from the state. So I'm suggesting that I think it would be appropriate that there should be at least one of the 4 options should be effectively be a low or no risk. And the other question is, I'm not simply talking about the state underpinning, but also the question of those who are, seeking what will be a contract for maybe 100,000 people, maybe 200,000, 300 down the line, if it becomes, for example, a default option or that. So the question of those providers giving, even if it is very, people know, yes, I put in all my money and I actually just got the same amount back. That's an awful scenario, it may seem. But I think for people knowing that that's the worst that can happen will give people an assurance versus that I can lose everything. Yep. So that's I'm saying. I think the question is not just does the risk with the individual and the state. There's also to what extent the risk is taken on by those providers.
Yeah. So there's ways and means of achieving that. You could have literally a cash fund. And an individual would have a guarantee about their funds coming out the other end, and there would be obviously capital requirements for the providers to ensure that that's delivered. Anything more than that, you begin to move into a quasi-DB kind of scenario, and that becomes to be more challenging. But certainly you could have a fund, and we'll have to do our analysis of the client group and so on, and what the goals are for them. But you could certainly have a cash-based fund. Whether that's best is something that would have to be debated out. But you could have it. In terms of I think tension you referred to on tax relief, I think, as you'll know, tax relief is a responsibility of the Department of Finance, and our colleagues in the department, as part of a commitment made in the roadmap for reform, are currently reviewing the cost to the exchequer of tax relief and looking at it in that space. What we concentrated on was trying to identify the needs of the particular population that we're talking about, and suggesting that if the policy objective is as we set it, well then it would appear that the kind of structure we're talking about would be better for that population. We haven't taken a position on the wider system of tax relief. Having said that, I have to say, in terms of it's been one of the kind of lightning rods of conversation in the sectoral interests we've discussed. Some have kind of expressed a view that you have. Others have also said to us, well, the marginal rate of tax relief in Ireland is particularly low, and any suggestion around reducing that higher rate of tax relief is going to compromise the very thing that you're talking about in terms of adequacy, because you'll have a lot of very moderate earners who are saving for the retirement who will effectively have a wage drop if the current system of tax relief is reduced. Now that's an open question. Somebody on 40,000, 45,000, if tax relief was removed from 40 to 33% or a 3-for-1 or some other structure, they would suffer a tax relief and may well have a particular type of behaviour that we don't want to see as a result, as in back out of pension saving.
Yeah, you don't suffer tax relief, though. Tax relief is not income, it is basically public subsidies, so it is a balancing of the goods. It's simply a matter of saying this is public expenditure. They will still have whatever they've put in so far. They benefit from the tax relief on a yearly basis, so there's nothing that they haven't benefited from, if you know what I mean. But there is a matter of deciding, do we spend the 2.6 billion on that? I mean, there's lots of things that would be wonderful, but in everything, again, we have to balance it against our public policy pension goals. And that is the core. And I would think that this scheme, for example, here, for those persons on the 40,000 and the 50,000, this scheme here, which is giving effectively a 33%, is a very positive one. You're not talking about a reduction to the standard rate. You are actually talking about not only the 33% from the state, but also an employer contribution. So effectively, for most people in that bracket, I think this scheme is going to be significantly better. My worry is that we would end up still continuing to subsidise a scheme for, as I think was even specifically mentioned, if you're on a private scheme, if you're getting 30,000, 40,000, if you're getting a 40% and you have a customised that, I think it was quite an extraordinary thing, the idea that we've 1% of the population, but 50% of the schemes. If you have a personalised investment scheme that the state is subsidising to 40%, in a way, why would you move to this scheme? You know what I mean? And that's a danger. I think that this scheme should be basically taken up as much as possible and should work for as many of the population as possible. And I think it is a better scheme for someone on 40,000 or 50,000.
I suppose it's a slightly different argument than the detail of how it's a policy decision rather than the operation of auto enrolment scheme. But
they intersect effectively.
In terms of the question on the cap, we had envisaged the cap in terms of the financial incentive at 75,000, twice the average wage-ish. So either 2% of whatever you contribute up to a max of 75,000. And in terms of we raised a question on corporation tax, again, not particularly an area of this department's policy responsibility, but we had seen a continuation of the status as it stands for current employers making private provision, 10%.
Okay. Can I just ask, I'll come to you next, Deputy Brady. The scheme to be fully operational will take half a century. By the time you get up to the 6%, and then somebody has the opportunity to pay into it for 45 years. So this is way down the road. But when the scheme is introduced initially, there will be people who will be in work for 10 years or who have been working for 20 or 30, so they'll be in transition. They will never get the full pot to bring them to the 60% or whatever. Are they still restricted to the 6% of earnings, or is there an opportunity for them to pay in at a top-up rate to increase that pot?
So we've said that an individual can decide to put in what they want, but the state matching contribution would end when you hit that 75, as will the employer. We've also said in the short-term individuals can make more of a contribution than they are legally required to under the conditions of the system. Employers will only be required during the first 6 years to match up to that 1, 2, 3, 4, and that's to manage costs. So an individual can make what decisions they like, to be frank.
I'm particularly talking about the fact that somebody might all of a sudden realise they're 50 years of age, there's only 20 years of contributions. To be meaningful, they might need to go beyond the 6%, and the scheme accommodates that.
Yes, it does.
Okay.
I would also say, I suppose, in terms of our messaging, we need to be cautious. There's an element of under-promise and over-deliver. And in terms of achieving what we have always said is adequacy, based on that idea of maintaining living standards. For somebody who hasn't saved or is saving a moderate amount, it's a high bar. So an element of our marketing and sales on this will be that you are improving your preparedness for retirement, your financial readiness. Selling it as something that will achieve the sun, moon and stars for you will probably get us into a bad space, just because of the level of contributions that people make during the course of their working career, you know. So it's improving your financial readiness.
But that's why I'm making the point that somebody who's halfway through their working life needs to be aware they're not going to hit that 60%. That's,
absolutely.
If they want to get closer to the 60%, the scheme allows them to pay additional, because people's, maybe children are finished in college or whatever, people's circumstances change.
Yeah, and what we'll try and do as part of the communications is set out pen pictures, models, that kind of thing, to give people that kind of idea of what it'll really mean for them. You know, in the same way that pen pictures around the budget are put together, to give people some indication of the impact it may have on them. Similarly with this, we'll try and do something like that as part of the communications.
Deputy Brady.
Yeah, just on an unrelated issue, we know the state has failed to put in place a pension scheme following a Labour Court ruling for CE supervisors. So I'm just looking at I suppose the entire community and voluntary sector, where the Minister has said time and time again that, you know, to enact that Labour Court ruling and put in place a pension system for CE supervisors and assistant supervisors, they'd have to look at the entire community and voluntary sector, which was costly. 500 million, I think, was the figure put out there. I suppose just the impact on this scheme on the community and voluntary sector for employers to be able to roll this out. Has there been an assessment carried out in terms of the ability for the community voluntary sector to be able to fund this? Because we know that the funding is limited, it's very tight. And just to see as to whether there has been any thought given, or are we hoping that there will, that the Labour Court ruling, I had hoped to see something, provision being made in the budget this year for a pension scheme to be put in place for CE supervisors. That hasn't materialised. Is the department looking at an overall pension scheme separate to this for the community and voluntary sector?
Thank you, Deputy Brady.
No, is the short answer. First of all, I think There are two different things there. CE and community and voluntary are two different things. CE is
But
a
the
matter...
Minister's the one that's kind of muddled them all.
No, I know, but CE is a matter for the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform. We don't have an involvement in a determination on the pension arrangements for people in that, so I can't comment any further on it, to be honest, because I'm not entirely clear what PER's current policy is. The community and voluntary pillar is like any employer, really. If somebody is an employee of an organisation and they're not in a pension scheme and they fit within the parameters that we've set out in the strawman, assuming that those are the parameters that are ultimately adopted by government and put into law, then that person would be auto-enrolled. Now, obviously, in the same way as with any employer, that would have an impact on the bottom line for the employer. That will have to be looked at as part of the continuous consultation. But the one set of organisations that is involved in the consultation quite extensively with us and is turning up to roadshow events is the community and voluntary pillar, which is great. So we expect to fully hear what they think about how this will work for them and for their employees and staff members as we progress it.
Senator Higgins,
yeah, just very briefly, the question on the voluntary contributions, I think it's really positive that people can make voluntary contributions. I kind of note, though, it is quite difficult for people making voluntary contributions to the contributory pension at the moment, and I think it's something I've often pushed for, that I think it should be easier to make voluntary contributions to the contributory pension. Just wondering about the tension potential around concern, or has concern been coming through the concern around persons being afraid that this might affect their eligibility for the non-contributory pension for those who are on particularly low incomes and things, that concern of how it intersects. And I recognise the 20,000 there as part of that, but just a thought on that. And the question, I think the community and voluntary scheme, again, there's engaging, and I can see that the sector are engaging, but to a large extent the state often has contracts with the community voluntary sector, and indeed with private employers and private, so almost feeding into state procurement, for example. There will be a recognition that to an extent this is, because there's corporate tax doesn't apply, for example, to state and to community and voluntary sector. So while private companies may be able to use the corporate tax route, for the community and voluntary sector, if they are increasing their contributions, corporate tax write-off isn't going to be an option for them. There may need to be looked to a measure around that, and particularly if the state is effectively signing an 8-year or 10-year contract with the community or organisation. So again, just to mention that for some employers there's a support being given that is not available maybe to other employers, so something supplementary might need to be done. Just my final thing, which is, again, it's slightly related, but the question of on that contributory pension, and we talked about the numbers of contributions, the very strong feedback that has come through from most representative organisations that a 40-year contributory requirement for the total contribution pension is too much, and that we should be sticking to the 30-year, which was originally there in the pension plan. I know that came through from the large representative organisations on the recent consultation. So again, how they intersect.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Duggan or Mr. Nicholson?
We've got 300 submissions or thereabouts on the total contributions approach for the state pension, and there's all flavours of opinion in those submissions. So we're currently assessing those, and we'll be preparing a report for the Minister and for the Government in due course on that. And the point you make is obviously one of those opinions that's expressed. There are others, though, just to highlight that are slightly different. Yes, I know. But
I know that the larger representative organisations have been quite clear.
We'll look again at your point about it being easier to make contributions to the SIF in respect of getting a contributory state pension. We'll look at that again and see if there's things we can do there. Was there one other? Non-con. Non-con has a set of rules that are set out in legislation around means assessment. There's no intention of changing those rules as things currently stand, and therefore whatever incomes are reckonable in terms of assessing the means of an individual will be reckonable. the introduction of a new pension system or somebody saving into a pension system doesn't really impact on those rules as things currently stand. That doesn't mean we won't look at that as we progress this. We obviously will. We'll look at every single aspect of it we possibly can to see the implications and impacts it could have. But it would, given the type of income levels we're talking about and the savings that would accrue from that, it's not obvious it'll have a massive material impact at this juncture. But we'll look at it.
And the community and voluntary sector employers was the other question.
Yeah, that corporate tax isn't an option for them to avail of. Yeah. And again, I can't give you an answer now on whether measures or incentives or whatever could be brought out to help them in dealing with this. But again, it's obviously a second order issue we'll look at as we progress it. Yeah.
Maybe just to add a quick point on the state pension. Part of the principle, and I think you may be able to see our thinking on this around the commitments made in the roadmap for pension reform, which for the first time committed to try and maintain the state pension at 34% of average wages over the long term, and to remove the decisions around state pension levels from the annual kind of budget cycle into an indexation, some form of indexation, but specifically with automatic enrolment in mind. So in order to give the broad population confidence that this first pillar they will have over the long term, what would they need to build on top of that first pillar to get what they want for themselves, without the suggestion that if you do save for your retirement, that first pillar may be reduced. The intention was to give confidence over the long term that that is safe and secure, and it gives you transparency in terms of what you need to save for yourself. That's specifically why that job was done, to make sure there was a coherency between the two systems.
And when it comes to means testing, individualisation, for example, of means testing could be one of the ways that's tackled. So if you have someone in a household who is engaging in this scheme, is it jeopardising somebody else in the household who might be hoping to get the non-contributory pension? I think that's one of the areas that we need to maybe look at.
Thank you, Senator. Mr Nicholson, Mr Duggan, thank you for your presentation today. It was very informative. It's obviously a complex and detailed process and will evolve. You might, from time to time, keep the committee updated on the progress, particularly after the closure for submissions for the straw man, and also, in particular, I suppose, in terms of any of the wider analysis, like I'm very struck and taken by the fact that this will have a seismic shift in terms of the sheer volume of money that's going into private pensions. It will be taken from the economy, and I suppose the assessment and impact that analysis that you do around that, because as you said at the outset, it will affect growth figures, and with that volume of cash coming out of day-to-day expenditure, because it's clearly not being saved at the moment. So there's a wider economic impact, and any of the data that you have on that, you might keep the committee informed, and we look forward to seeing you back here, because this will evolve over time on this issue again. Thank you very much. And colleagues, our next we'll stand adjourned until 10 a.m. on Thursday the 25th of October. Thank you very much.